Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What horror movie situation have you ever found yourself in? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was 17 and hanging out with this girl I had a thing for at the time. I had locked my keys in my car while we were at a movie and had to wait for the tow truck. It happened that we were seeing the midnight show for The Dark Knight, so AAA didn't get there until 3 a.m. We're driving back finally, and it's about 3:15 a.m. I drive an old 1990 Chevy Corsica, so it's definitely not the greatest car in the world. As we're heading back, we get to a four-way stop in this little town. I see a truck just sitting at the cross-section. I waited to let them go because they had the right-of-way. They weren't moving. I waited a bit more, but they weren't going, so I figured, okay, I'll go slowly through the intersection. As soon as I keep going, they pull out behind me. I'm a little nervous at this point because they were waiting for me to keep going. I turned to head in the general direction of her house, and they began to follow. I switched on my high beams so I could see better because this was pretty dark and windy road. I know we're being followed at this point, and I don't know what to do. I have her grab her phone, dial 911, and be ready, just in case we have to call them. As soon as I tell her to get the phone ready, everything goes black. My high beams malfunctioned, and I shut off all my lighting. I'm dead in the water, and I have to stop completely, or else we're going off the road. I turn on my hazard lights, and suddenly the car behind us is gone. No headlights, no truck. I had the door locked, and I kept trying to turn on the headlights. Eventually they come back on, and we get to her house, but I'll never forget how terrifying that was at 17. My friend lives on the edge of a vast tract of government and commercial land. There's an unused TNT ammunition factory, a nature trail, and then acres upon acres of power lines, routes, and forest. Growing up, even into high school, we would always go exploring in the woods. We were actually pretty safe about it, as we always had his dog with us. They loved it, and he collected medieval weapons, so we would be running around with knives, axes, and machetes. We had a grand old party at his house on New Year's Eve a few years ago. We were 20-ish, and spent the night there. We were a close group with nothing to do, so we spent the day there as well, playing video games and stuff. Evening rolls around, and we want to go exploring in the woods, so off we go as usual, dogs and everything. While we're walking around, we discover this absolutely trashed campsite. There were ripped t-shirts hanging on tree limbs, trash everywhere, logs thrown about, chairs turned over and broken, and a tent still standing. The tent was totally jacked up. Slashes in the fabric, sleeping bags still inside, a frickin' axe by the tent. No one will ever be around. We opened the tent to find all sorts of equipment still inside. We never saw a soul. We checked back that morning and it was still there. We checked the news and we still never saw anyone. The obvious conclusion is that someone with a lot of money threw a raging camping party for New Year's Eve and just ditched the gear. But that still seems like a perfect horror movie setup. It really freaked us out when we stumbled upon it. I lived in Gambia for a little while when I was younger. One night, I went out for an evening stroll in my neighborhood where I would call my girlfriend in the state and walk around in nothing but moonlight, because power outages were more the norm than having lit homes and streets. As I walked, I noticed that there were men in military uniforms with automatic weapons appearing throughout my neighborhood. This wasn't too disconcerting because the Gambian military has a presence in the country. Also, I lived only a few miles from the U.S. consulate, which is swimming with military personnel. So, I was accustomed to the sight. I just continued walking. Finally, when I hung up the phone, I said hello to one of the guards. He shushed me and indicated that I come over to him. He told me that there had been a murder, a brutal stabbing, about a quarter of a mile from my house shortly before I went on my call, and that the military had been watching me on my call, seeing if the attacker would target me because they hadn't caught him yet. He told me I should probably go home for the night. TLDR, I was unwitting bait for a murderer in Gambia. Another story of Gambia involves me staying out way too late in a suburb of Banjul. I had a great time and wasn't drunk, so I decided to catch a bush taxi home. It must have been 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was about 5 miles from home. Of course, at 2 a.m., all of the good family men who are bush taxi drivers are at home and in bed. There was a taxi driver who offered to take me back to my place for something outrageous like $4. Being the prudent and poor person that I was, I scoffed at his ridiculous price, and he zoomed off to find another with a better sense than me. I was about a mile and a half into the walk home when I realized that I was walking really close to the river and that someone had just been attacked along the side of the road by a very large crocodile. At this point, I thought that maybe those $4 would have been well spent. Of course, I had no choice now. It was pitch dark, and there wasn't another decent person on the road for 3 miles. I could barely see the road, and I couldn't tell if I was following it. To top it off, there were increasingly bizarre noises from the inside of the road. It was so dark that I couldn't even make silhouettes against the night sky. I started to panic and worry that I was going to be attacked by something or someone. I don't know how long I stumbled along in the darkness. It felt like hours, and the buzzing of insects in the humid air was growing to a maddening pitch. A light in the distance behind me caught my attention. 2 headlights grew increasingly bright. At this point, I dodged off to the side of the road, paranoid that the car's occupants would choose this desolate and isolated spot on the road to attack me. Instead, and in spite of my bad attempt at hiding, the driver of what happened to be a taxi rolled up next to me. He gave me the look of a disapproving father. Here was a middle-aged man who knew the folly of youth. His look said, "Get in the car, you idiot. What do you think you're doing?" Without negotiating the price, I got in his taxi, a major no-no if you've ever lived there. He simply asked me where I lived and drove me home. About halfway there, I realized that I hadn't negotiated the price and asked him to stop until we had. His response was totally deadpan. "Don't be silly. I can charge you whatever I want, and you will pay," he said. And he was right. I would have paid him $100, pretty much all the money I had in my name at that point. He turned and smiled and said, "But I won't. I'll be fair." He was more than fair, asking for only about $1 for the fare. TLDR was stupid. I risked a crocodile attack and abduction for a few dollars. In February 2005 or 06, my cousin had just bought a new flat-screen TV and gave me his old CRT-1 to take up to our grandfather's lake house. "Make sure you don't set the clock," he told me as we wrestled it into the back seat of my car. I figured it was because there was no point. The lake house loses power all the time. I got up to the lake house in the late afternoon. It was cold and blustery, and the power was out. I figured it was because of the wind, so I hauled the TV in and put it on top of the old RCA console TV. Yes, a working TV on top of a non-working TV. Very redneck of us. And built a fire in the fireplace. I set up my Coleman lantern and read a 1985 issue of Field and Stream until I fell asleep, cozy in my sleeping bag in front of the fire. I woke up just after midnight to the sound of the refrigerator kicking on. Funny how you don't notice it sounds like that most of the time. I saw that the red light on the TV was blinking now. Cool, the house has power again. So I walked over to the TV and set the time, went to pee off the front porch, then went into the kitchen to get some water. I cut on the kitchen light and noticed a huge beige stain in the front of the refrigerator. I stared at it for a couple of seconds when I saw it and the stain fall onto the floor. It was moving. I edged closer. It wasn't a stain, it was maggots, and they were writhing. The power had been off for a few hours. It had been off for weeks, long enough for all the cut-up bait in the freezer to rot completely and become maggot-infested. My fire had warmed the cabin just enough for them to come out of hibernation. I quickly got dressed and started to work in the kitchen. I swept the maggots out the kitchen door, and they just kept coming. Finally, I pushed the fridge onto the porch and spent the next hour cleaning the kitchen before heading back to the living room and the fire. After a tense half hour, I finally drifted off to sleep and woke up to someone screaming, "This is a 5-inch blade in fine 4-0 steel," and I have no idea what he said next because I was fighting my way out of the sleeping bag and wondering whether to run, screaming, or try to make it to the kitchen for a knife. And F the kitchen, man, it's full of maggots. And so I was out the door and hiding behind my car when I heard the same voice from the cabin again say, "Folks, we'll throw in 4 more knives exactly like this one if you place your order in the next..." Oh yeah, my cousin's TV. The one he told me not to set the clock on, because if you set the clock, then every morning it comes on at 2:37 a.m. at full blast for exactly 1 minute, then shuts itself back off. And some dickhead infomercial was trying to sell me knives because what people do at 2:30 in the morning apparently is buy knives. So I went back inside, unplugged the TV, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. And outside, I started hearing the unmistakable sound of a tall, heavy man walking through the underbrush. Christ. I got dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and braved the kitchen to grab the big knife, then slipped out the back door. I circled the woods, homing in on the intruder. The wind is blowing, trees are swaying, there's no moon, and the intruder is walking, then pausing, then walking again. I steeled myself, then leapt from behind a tree, screaming, "Who's there? Show yourself!" and waving my flashlight in hopefully the right direction. Nothing. Then the footsteps again. I waved my flashlight around until I finally found my enemy. It was a possum, just ambling along. Bastard didn't even look up at me. He just kept walking along, shoving leaves aside as they went. It was close to 5 a.m. before I got back to sleep. 90 minutes later, I woke to the sound of a car door slamming. I let out a sob when I heard someone walking the perimeter of the cabin. When I heard their heavy boots on the porch, I didn't care anymore. I just hoped they'd kill me before they had their way with me. I heard the door open. I heard the footsteps coming over to me as I crawled further down in my sleeping bag. Finally, I peeked out to see what my fate would be. Standing there in head-to-toe camouflage stood my brother. "Hey, asshole," he said. "Why's the fridge on the back porch?" Not freaky in a horror sense, but still freaky. When I was in high school, it was just my mom and me living in my house because my dad had recently moved away. We lived in a pretty nice neighborhood that constantly had a police car patrolling the area at night. I guess I forgot to close the garage door. We don't lock the door that leads into the house from the garage, and my mom woke up with a man walking into her bedroom. It was dark, and she screamed, "Who are you?" And the man said he was an officer. And when she didn't believe him, he showed her the badge and claimed it was routine for a police officer to search a house if the garage door was left open. I heard the noise and came down the stairs, yelling to my mom that I was going to call the police. The officer told us he was sorry for scaring us, but once again it was routine to check any house with the garage door left open and then left immediately. My mom called the police station the next day and asked if our house could be exempt from this protocol. They had no idea what she was talking about and said that they had never advised their officers to go into a house for that reason. They ended up figuring out which officer was on duty and firing him immediately. We still have no idea what he was planning on doing or what he could have done if we both had not been woken up. One of the many reasons I do not fully trust police officers. Once you started saying the 5-inch blade, I started immediately thinking of the old fail blog video of the guy with the samurai sword and he stabs himself. The guy's like, folks, right now, we may need emergency surgery in the studio. So I kind of threw that bad accent up there. But anyway, enjoy. I came back to my college apartment a couple of weeks early after Christmas break to work, so the building was pretty much empty. I played my answering machine, this was back in '92, and got this message. This is Sergeant X from the Milwaukee Police Department. There is a runaway that is staying in your apartment. Please call me at... My heart froze, assuming that this person had broken in and holed up in my place while I was gone and was probably there right now. I crept around looking for the person while saying, I promise I won't hurt you, just leave and we'll forget all about this. The last place I looked was behind the shower curtain. It was a scene right out of a movie where I threw the curtain open to find nothing. It turned out the police had the wrong number. They also said it was a 15-year-old Laotian girl who had run away. I'm pretty sure I could have taken her if need be. This one night when I was younger, my parents left me at home alone with my older sister. It was raining heavily and dark. We were already a little freaked out, being alone and everything, so we decided to put on the home security system thing. About 20 minutes later, the alarm starts ringing, and my sister and I are totally freaked out. We walk around the house and find that a side door to the house is open. The security company called, and we told them that everything was fine. We assumed the wind just blew the door open. So my sister and I relax a bit, turn off the security system, and go back to whatever we were doing before. A little later, we heard this really loud thump come from what felt like the floor we were standing on top of. Again, we didn't think too much of it. Our house was old and made weird sounds a lot. Well, before we went to sleep for the night, we checked around the house one more time. We found that the same door we had closed was open again. Totally freaked out, we decided to check out the whole house, including the basement under the floor we were previously on. Well, sure enough, in the basement, we find that one of my sister's creepy stuffed animals from when she was a kid had been nailed to the ceiling of the basement. We called our parents and they came home. They checked the entire house, and we never called the police. I never found out what exactly happened, but it could have been worse. It just never was the wind. This would fall under horror, I think. When I was 12 years old, my friend's sister took us to the beach. She was 19, so she didn't pay a lot of attention to us while we were out boogie boarding in the waves. We got tired and decided to start chatting like most 12-year-old girls do. We propped our arms up on the board, facing one another, with our feet dangling in the water as we talked about boys and school and whatever else. An hour probably went by, and since we were facing one another, we had realized that we drifted out pretty far, and we couldn't see anybody actually in the water. Then we saw a woman jumping up and down on the shore calling for us. At first, we thought she was talking to somebody else, and then we heard "shark." We quickly realized they were yelling at us and motioning for us to come back in because there was a shark close by. We freaked out and started swimming as fast as we could, but I had asthma and could feel my breathing starting to get shallower. The waves were pulling me back and I couldn't move forward. I seriously thought that any minute I would feel the sensation of teeth digging into my legs. A man got on his sailboat and made his way out to us. My friend got onto the boat first, and then I was second. As I tried to climb up, I slipped and fell back in, sending me into a panic. They both grabbed me and pulled me onto the boat. We never saw the shark, but the man told us they'd seen the fin swimming right by us. I love the beach, but I no longer go into the ocean past my calves. Scariest shit ever.